Starting chapter 5. Can y'all all hear me okay? Okay. So we're starting chapter 5. Chapter 5 is learning and unlearning. And some of this information in this chapter should sound very familiar to you because we talked about it in language in 279. So some of it is very similar. So for those who are just joining, I do have PowerPoint. I have an outline posted on Moodle, and there's no PowerPoints today. So we're just going to be talking through things. Okay, so when we're talking about learning and unlearning, there are 3 different concepts with stuttering and learning that that can contribute to its perpetuating. So you have classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and avoidance behaviors. So the first thing we're going to talk about is classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning is in reference to Pablo, when I'm sure many of you are familiar with Pablo and his dogs and the experiment that he did with the dog salivating whenever he would go to feed them. So he tried to see whether or not he could create that same results with a different stimulus. So he paired feeding the dog with the ringing of a bell, and eventually he could just ring the bell and the dogs would salivate. So that's known as classical conditioning. And the first signs of stuttering in a young child, what type of disfluencies do they usually exhibit? Remember, initially, when a child begins to stutter, what type of disfluencies do they usually exhibit?
Repetition.
Good, repetitions, that's right. So usually they have repetitions as the primary characteristics. Doesn't mean that they can't have blocks of prolongations, but typically they're repetitions. And so they have this repetition that occurs, which is basically an unconditioned response. They just produce this repetition. And initially, when it occurs, because it may be a mild repetition, the parent or the caregiver, doesn't really produce that significant of a response. So you have an unconditioned stimulus, which is an unconditioned response, which is the disfluency, the mild disfluency, with an unconditioned stimulus, which the parent isn't providing any type of reaction. Well, then the child disfluency gets more complex. They get more repetitions and more prolongations and blocks. And now the response you get from the parent or the caregiver is alarm or shock. And so that becomes a stimulus. So whenever the child sees that shock or stress within the parent, it causes a conditioned response, and the conditioned response is the stutter. So that is how classical conditioning can result in disfluencies. So with in this classical conditioning, disfluencies become noticeable to the child or to the parent. So initially, the child might not be aware that they're being disfluent, and the parent may not be overly concerned about their being disfluent. But then the child becomes aware of it, or the parent notices it and has some type of overt response to that child being disfluent. And so now you've started that cycle. Remember, we've constantly talked about how disfluencies are a cycle. The child is disfluent, it causes a reaction either in themselves or someone else, which creates tension and stress. That tension and stress causes the child to be more disfluent, which causes more tension and stress in the listener, which causes more tension and stress in the child, and so forth and so on. And so it builds and builds and builds, and and eventually they may add on some secondary behaviors within their stuttering. So that is the concept of your conditioned responses and your unconditioned responses. So we talked about that already. So stuttering elicits feelings of stress and anxiety. And when you get stressed and anxious, what happens in your body? It's not a hard question. What happens in your body when you get stressed or tense?
You feel bad, you get nervous, you have a...
How does your body react to that?
That's a good question.
Think about it. What happens when you're stressed and tense? What happens to your body?
You get a headache.
Yeah.
Okay, you get a headache. Okay, that could be one thing. What else?
It's hard to think clearly sometimes.
Okay. What else? I have a muscle right here and I get a knot. Okay, when I get stressed and tense, my muscles get very tense and tight. Okay, so the same thing happens when someone is trying to fight those disfluencies. They get tense and they get anxious, so their muscles get tense. Your muscles, what controls your ability to speak?
Your muscles.
What are the muscles involved in communication?
All the muscles, your larynx and your articulators.
Yes, your articulators are manipulated by muscles. Your vocal cord, all the muscles that are innervated in your laryngeal area to allow you to intake that air and articulate that or produce that puff of air that produces your sounds, okay, and your words. So all of those muscles become tense and tight. And so that also contributes to your producing a disfluent response. So again, it is a vicious cycle that occurs. So that's classical conditioning. So you have an unconditioned response, an unconditioned stimulus, or an unconditioned stimulus, which gets paired either purposely or non-purposely in the experiment with Pavlov and his dogs and the bell. That was purposeful, but in fluency, you have this non-purposeful conditioned response that develops just because of the process that occurs, the reaction of the people who are listening to the person speaking. So initially it's an unconditioned response, and because of the stimulus of the results or the effect that their communication has on the listener, Then you build that conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, which is the disfluency. And so we're going to talk about conditioned response, operant conditioning, and avoidance behavior. And then we're going to talk about how to break these cycles. So we'll talk about how to change this behavior. So these three situations, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and avoidance behavior, are all learned behaviors. And we're going to talk about how to unlearn those behaviors. So any questions about classical conditioning?
What would be the conditioned stimulus?
I'm sorry, what?
The conditioned stimulus, what would that be?
So the conditioned stimulus would be the response of the listener. So initially, this child is disfluent. That's the response. Okay, so think about Pavlov's dog is salivating. That's an unconditioned response. Okay, well, when the stimulus is when he would walk in to go, when in the morning he'd walk in and his dogs would initially salivate just because he walked in, because they know that he's coming to feed them. So the unconditioned stimulus is the parent or the listener. Okay, they're not having a response. The child is producing that disfluency. It's an unconditioned response. It's a natural, well, it's a within that child, it's a normal thing that happens with them, or it's a normal recurrence. But then what happens is, as the disfluencies get worse, so initially it may just be, just a part word repetition, and may just be on one or two words. But then as the child's, the intensity of their learning increases, and as we talked about in the last chapter, that as the neuro connections can't multitask very well. So as they're trying to learn more and more information, then they start being more and more disfluent. Well, now, instead of just one disfluency here or there, the next time they try to communicate and they are more disfluent, now the listener reacts. So that reaction now becomes a conditioned response, because the child realizes that the listener is alarmed, okay, or confused. And so they become conditioned that when they see that tension or that anxiety within the listener, that they are going to stutter. And it becomes a conditioned response, where it was an unconditioned response. Now it becomes a conditioned response, the disfluency. Does that make sense? Is it still confusing? If you look on page 91 in your book. If you look on page 91, there's a graphic that might be able to help you. So you can see in this picture, the little girl is going, look at the cat. And mom, the child has a few little simple disfluencies. The parent is calm and acceptable, okay? Because it was nothing major, just some minor disfluencies. Now the child goes, where is the mouse? So the child has more frequent and longer repetitions. Well, now the mom's like, oh, and she non-verbally and verbally has this response. So she might say, the parent might say something like, slow down, it's okay, just relax, okay? And start creating this results that causes tension. And then the child has much more intense disfluency. So now they're having repetitions that turn into prolongations and blocks, and the parent exhibits more alarm and more concern. And the child can see that in the parent, which creates this conditioned response. So now in their mind, they, the parent now is, as the listener, is showing alarm or concern before the child speaks, because they're like, oh goodness, is she going to stutter? Is he going to stutter? Or is he going to have problems? Which triggers that conditioned response where the child stutters more than what they initially started to. So something that may have been able to, or may have had a natural recovery had it not been brought attention to, may now perpetuate, because now they've created that conditioned response. Okay, is that a little better? I know it's a little confusing. Go ahead, Emily, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I'm just still like lost on like what each one would be.
What?
So like the unconditioned response and like all of them.
Okay, let me see what the example is in the book here. That might be helpful. So if on page 90, it talks about classical condition of components of stuttering. And see, the initial stuttering disfluencies are most often repetitions of syllables or words. At first, the child gets no reaction from their productions. So it is an unconditioned response. It's just something that happens, and the parent's response is unconditioned. Okay, there's no alarm, there's no tension. It's a very calm, it's just the listener is there, so there's no type of signal from the listener to the child. Okay, there's no visible expectation on the part of the listener that there's tension or stress, like, oh my gosh, is she going to stutter this time when she tries to talk? So like that would be related to like the ringing of the bell. Okay, so before, when parent or the listener was talking to the child, that would be like when Pavlov would just walk in and the dogs would salivate. Okay, so mom walks in, child starts talking, has mild disfluencies. Both of those are unconditioned. There is no connection. Just happens to be disfluent. Mom just happens to be listening to the child. So it's a natural response that's happening within the child, okay? Because we know they go through periods of normal non-fluency, right? When they're trying to develop their communication skills. So he's got these normal non-fluencies, and he's just producing some mild repetitions, he or she. Well, now he's producing these normal non-fluencies, which is an unconditioned response. It's just happening. It's not something that they are aware of, okay? They're not aware of the disfluencies when they first start them, and it's not really causing any problems within their interactions. But all of a sudden, the child's having more problems, more repetitions. Now it's having prolongations. Now we get a reaction from the listener. The listener is now shocked or, oh, slow down. It's okay. Slow down. It's all right. Stop. Start over. Take your time. Okay, so we're getting this conditioned response. So now every time the child is talking and is disfluent, parent is adding this verbiage: stop, slow down, start over again. Okay, so we're getting this situation that's occurring. So that makes that's a conditioned response. The child is now conditioned to the prodding by the parent or the caregiver regarding the alarm. So anytime they see that tension and alarm within the listener, it's going to make their disfluency worse. And that's the conditioned response. Because now, before where they weren't aware of it, it was just something that was happening. Now it's become a conditioned response to the affect of the listener. A little better? Okay. If I find some information that might explain it a little better, I'll put that out there. Okay? All right. So let's go on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning deals with a behavior and its consequences. Now, we talked about operant conditioning in relations to treatment in 279. Can someone tell me about operant conditioning?
B.F. Skinner.
Yes, that's right. B.F. Skinner. What are the components of them and what does it mean? The components are listed in your notes.
What was your question?
What are the components of operant conditioning?
Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment.
Okay, very good. So you have positive reinforcers, negative reinforcers, and punishment. So how does that work in relation to communication when learning language? Remember, try to think back to 279 when we talked about how does this help in developing language skills?
Well, like if the child starts talking and then mom or dad gets excited and they're like, yay, yay. Well, then the kid wants to say it again because they want that same reaction.
Yes, very good. So that's a positive reinforcer, okay? And then we have negative reinforcers, which stop an unpleasant behavior. And what about punishment? Is that necessarily a negative, a bad thing? No, it's not. Punishment is not like, you know, you think of when you were a child and you did something wrong, you got punished. No, punishment is more of a removing of or a not providing a reinforcer. So, you know, child wants a cookie and initially child was going cook, and mom would say, oh, okay, you want a cookie. And so she would give him the cookie. So that's a positive reinforcement. Well, now he's going, he can say more. He's producing, you know, many more single words, but he's still going for cookie. And so mom may expect him to now say cookie. And so when he goes cook, she's like, no, that's cookie. And so that's not, you know, it's not a punishment per se, but she's denying him the reinforcement of giving him the cookie until he correctly produces the word. So a positive reinforcer is when following a behavior, it's going to make that behavior or help that behavior to increase. So giving the child praise, giving them what they ask for, like a cookie or candy or so forth, is a positive reinforcer. Then you have negative reinforcer, which is meant to stop an unpleasant experience. So following a behavior, it can also cause the behavior to increase, because if you give a negative reinforcer, you're stopping the unpleasant and reinforcing the correct response. So it also can increase in the behavior that you want. Punishment is following a behavior will cause a behavior to decrease. So you can have positive and negative type reinforcers, which can increase the frequency of the correct response, or increase the frequency of a response. Let me put it that way. And then punishment, which is to decrease the frequency. So how does this relate to disfluencies or stuttering? So if a child is stuck in a stutter and nods his head or blinks his eyes to get through that stutter, then nodding the head and blinking the eyes becomes a reinforcer. Because in the person who stutters mind, that blinking of the eyes and the nodding of the head help them to get through the block, help them to produce what they were trying to produce. So that becomes a reinforcer for that behavior. So they have the unpleasant response of being stuck in a stutter. So they start with that secondary behavior of nodding their head or blinking their eyes, and it helps them get over their stutter. So it becomes a reinforcer. Is that a negative or a positive reinforcer?
Positive.
Is that the desired behavior to stutter?
No.
So would it be a negative or a positive reinforcer?
Negative.
Yes, negative. So the nodding of the head and the blinking of the eyes is reinforcing their ability to stutter or to get over the stutter. But that's not really the behavior that we want. You don't want them to have to trigger those secondary behaviors of nodding their head and blinking their eyes in order to be fluent. So that's a negative reinforcer. Does that make sense, Alicia?
Is it because it's like enabling stuttering?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, it what happens is that the nodding of the head and the blinking the eyes is a negative in the sense that it's distracting to the listener and it calls more attention to the person who stutters disfluencies. So yes, it may help them to be able to produce the word that they want to say, but it's a negative behavior. It's not a positive behavior. A positive behavior would be where they could produce the word without stuttering, without the secondary behavior of nodding their head and blinking their eyes. Okay. So here's another example. So if a behavior reduces negative stimulation, it is a negative reinforcement or escape, and it increases the behavior. So if you have someone who's going, I like to go to the Big Apple. Okay, what kind of behavior is that? We learned that in the last set of material. He's going, I like to go to the Big Apple.
Avoidance.
Avoidance.
What kind of
It's
avoidance?
avoidance.
Yes,
Word
it is
change.
avoidance, but what
Changing
kind?
the word. Changing the
that?
word. Changing the word.
Okay, yes, it's changing the word,
Because
which
it
is
was
known
saying
as
new
what?
and then another word.
Yeah, but what is that known as?
Escape.
Yes, it's an escape behavior. So he's using an escape from say couldn't get the N out, so changes it to the Big Apple. So so that becomes a negative reinforcer, okay? Because he's able to escape that disfluency by changing to another word. But that's not what you want them to be able to do. You want them to be able to get through the production of new without having to do an escape behavior. Okay, so you see how in disfluency, how operant conditioning can affect disfluencies. And a lot of what's occurring is your negative reinforcers. So that kind of should give you some kind of an idea of how you're going to help them unlearn this, right? What do you think would be what you're going to need to do? Is Tommy Lou here today? Don't see Tommy today. Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, hi, Tommy. Didn't see you there. So if we're trying to unlearn this operant conditioning that is being reinforced, the disfluencing is being reinforced through negative reinforcement, what do you think we're going to have to do to be able to help them get over this?
Are you asking me this question?
No, I'm asking everybody, but do you know what it is? What's
Use
the other?
positive. Use
Yes.
positive reinforcement.
Yes, Laterica, yes, very good. So we're gonna have to change those negative reinforcers to positive reinforcers, okay? So teaching them the, oh, Cam, that's very distracting. Can you please take that back to a plain background? Cam, do you hear me? Okay. All right. So let's go on to avoidance conditioning, which is our third quality. So you have operant conditioning, you have classical conditioning, and now we're going to talk about avoidance conditioning. So avoidance conditioning. Avoidance behavior is something that we all engage in. We do this, we all do this. We avoid starting a paper. You avoid studying for a test, okay? So we all have these avoidance behaviors. Avoidance behavior is best understood as a combination of classical and operant conditioning. So we, I don't know if y'all remember in 270, y'all remember in 279, I showed y'all that video of Bart Simpson with the cupcake. You remember that? That every time Lisa was doing the experiment with the mouse and giving it the cheese, and when it would try to go get the cheese, it would get zapped. Okay, and so it learned not to go get the cheese because it would get a punishment. Well, Bart kept going to get the cupcake and would keep getting zapped and just kept going to try to get the cupcake. Y'all remember that? Maybe, kind of, sort of. Heather remembers, okay. So avoidance behavior is best understood as a combination of classical and operant conditioning. So rats in these experiments were conditioned to fear. In actuality, the experiments that were originally done were with a buzzer, and they conditioned the rats to be fearful of the sound of a buzzer, because the buzzing sound usually followed with an electric shock. So they learned that, you know, when they heard that buzzer, they anticipated an electric shock. However, the rats learned that if they jumped to a different part of the box when the buzzer sounded, they weren't shocked. Okay, so you see how that they had that operant conditioning where they had a stimulus, unconditioned, a conditioned response. So the conditioned response was getting the electric shock, okay? The stimulus was the buzz. But then they learned that if they jumped to another part of the box, then they wouldn't get the shock. So they learned a way to have positive reinforcement by moving to another part of the box. So that's how avoidance conditioning is a combination of your operant and classical conditioning. So this reduced because they learned this behavior of being able to jump to another part of the box, it helped to reduce that fear. So that created a positive, reducing that fear. So when we look at it in relation to stuttering, starting when they are children, individuals who stutter learn to avoid the threat and the fear and the anxiety that's associated with the moment of stuttering by using avoidance behaviors. So either using escape or circumlocutions or many different actions to be able to avoid that moment of stuttering. And remember, examples of avoidance behaviors are putting in extra sounds just before they say a word, changing the word to something else when they get stuck on it. And when they do this, changing those words or putting in those extra sounds, then what happens is they get the word out, right? They start a stutter where they go bub, 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 boy, okay? So they finally get the word out. So it creates this reinforcement in them that, okay, if I produce extra sounds in front of the words, eventually I'm going to get it out. Now you have to remember that this is not a conscious effort that they're doing. This is just happening within their little minds, okay? So the extra sounds give the person a feeling that they will be able to say the feared word after a few repetitions of extra sounds. So it kind of becomes a conditioned response. They can't produce the word, so they have these extra sounds that they produce in front of it, and they're able to produce it. So it becomes a negative reinforcer. Having those extra sounds allows them to say the word that they're trying to say, so they are negatively reinforced for that. And then what usually happens in the reaction of the listener, as far as once they are able to get the word out, how does the listener typically react? When you're listening to someone who is disfluent and they are stuck on a word and they finally get it out, what does that trigger in you?
Maybe a little anxiousness.
That they're able to get the word out?
Oh no, I guess relief.
Yes, that's it. Okay. So what happens is once they're able to get the word out, then in the listener, it triggers this sense of relief that can be seen visually on the point of the listener. So that creates a negative reinforcer, okay? Because now they've got this, they've had this disfluency that it helped them to get these repetitions that helped them get through the word, and they were able to say the word, and it created relaxation in their listener. Yes, it did, but it didn't help the disfluency. So now, you know, in a subconscious way, they like, okay, well, I'm producing these extra sounds in front of the words. It helps me get the words out, and it helps my listener to relax, which is flawed logic, but that is a component of disfluencies. So putting in those extra sounds become a negative reinforcer. So just like we were saying in my earlier example with the New York, so anticipating a stutter and doing something to keep it from happening. So in this case, the person, instead of doing the Big Apple, he may just go, I like to go to New York, and eliminate the N altogether. Okay, so just say, I like to go to Unark. So those sounds that are problematic, he just avoids saying them. Or maybe says several times. I like to go to New York. Okay, so adding extra sounds, adding extra syllables to help the person to get their words out. So, okay, so we've talked about classical condition, operant and avoidance behaviors. Now let's talk about, those are all learning behaviors. Let's talk about unlearning. So what are the clinical implications? How can we overcome these incidents? So to deal with classical conditioning first, what we need to do is decondition the person who stutters. So we want to associate a behavior with a neutral stimulus. So we want to neutralize that conditioned stimulus. So we want to, what you would do is have the client continue to stutter, to continue to produce that disfluency until the fear is gone. So you're going to not provide them as the stimulus with that fear and anxiety. So here's where you're going to be educating mom, dad, caregiver, and say, so when he is disfluent, you just be patient. Don't react. Give him all the time he needs to be able to get the words out. So previously, when he would stutter, the listener, the mom would, or the parent would be shocked and show worry and alarm. We need to decondition that. So now what you're teaching is that whenever he's disfluent, you just be patient and just wait and have your outward appearance to be one of calm and relaxation. That's going to help to decrease the fear in the person who stutters. So you're breaking that cycle. You're diminishing that conditioned stimulus. You're changing the conditioned stimulus from one of fear and worry in the case of the listener to one of relaxation. So when you display a appearance of relaxation and ease, it will reflect onto the person who stutters. And then they will be able to lessen that tension that they're feeling inside themselves. Another technique is you can do counter conditioning. Counter conditioning is associated with positive stimuli. So have the client stutter and receive praise for keeping the stutter going and ending it easily. So they stutter, they get through it, and you're like, you did really great with that. Good work. You eased through those words, you used techniques, you did really well. So the client is rewarded, and it gives them a sense of being in control. So remember that the disfluency, the feelings, remember that iceberg we saw, all those different those different emotions underneath the surface where they feel, you know, dejected, they feel alone, they feel that they are out of control. All of those different feelings contributing to the severity of their disfluency. But if we can help to change that condition and make them give them a feeling or a sense of praise or a positive sense, then it can help to decrease and break that classical conditioning cycle. So have them stutter, you know, have them produce their speech. They are in a stutter. They use different techniques to help them get through the stutter. And when they're done, you provide praise and positive feedback. You did great getting through that. Wonderful. You made it through your sentence that you wanted to say. Great job. Okay. So giving them praise. The client is also rewarded by the feeling of being in control. So when the stutter finally ends, make sure that you're giving them good eye contact and praise. So that helps with that classical conditioning. So in this example, there's an example on page, you'll see it on page 97. So the conditioned stimulus is the anticipation of stuttering. So the person has this anticipation of stuttering within themselves. That's the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is that they are going to be very tense and anxious, and they are going to stutter. Well, when you're doing treatment, the conditioned stimulus is the disfluency, the stuttering. The conditioned response, though, that you're trying to create now instead of tension is relaxation. So you're trying to create a relaxed stutter. So you can see in the picture, the person is going, mum. And so the clinician says, great job. You stayed in the stutter and you were able to get through it. Okay, so giving them positive reinforcement and giving them time to get through that disfluency. I got a few more pieces of information to talk about, and I want to get through this chapter. Okay, so when we're talking about operant conditioning, what we're trying to do here is to stop rewarding the unwanted behavior. So the unwanted behavior may be the secondary productions of nodding and eye blinking, or the disfluency itself. We want to stop rewarding that. We want to reward the wanted behavior. So have the client not release the word immediately after tension or squeezing their eyes or head nod or blinking. So, you know, if they get stuck and they are producing a head nod or an eye blink, you want to cut them off and say, okay, relax. All right. Now try to ease into it. You're breaking the cycle. Okay. Right now, as an operant condition, they have learned that if I nod my head and blink my eyes and do multiple repetitions, then I can get the word out. Well, you want to break that. You want to stop them from producing those productions immediately after they exhibit those characteristics. So when they do the eye blinks, the head nods, stop them and say, okay, let's do some easy onset, and then help them ease on into the right word. Break that cycle. And then teaching them those different techniques gives you reward them for that behavior. So that's the wanted behavior that you're trying to elicit. So finally, with avoidance behavior, so to deal with avoidance conditioning, you need to decrease the fear that they have in stuttering. So you need to decrease that fear. Remember, avoidance behavior is all about fear. So if the client is avoiding producing a word by using fillers such as like my name is Barry, have the client practice staying in the stutter on Barry. So, and then reward this. So like have them practice, which seems counterintuitive, where you have them stay in the stutter. So have them, my name is Barry, okay? So have them try to remove the and if they stutter on the word, at least they are not adding all that those extra sounds within their productions. And reward them when they exhibit non-avoidance. So having the client practice saying that phrase over and over and over again, we know that with repetition, the disfluencies decrease. So getting them to where they can eventually just say, my name is Barry, without all the different ums in there. And then reward them exuberantly, okay, or empathetically. You know, great job, you did it, you got that out, it was all smooth, each one of the words came out very easy. And so giving them lots and lots of praise for the positive. So you can see a lot of the treatment in these respects is going to be changing their emotional feeling about their ability to produce smooth, easy words. Okay? So any questions about this? I know we kind of went through these, but we've had a lot of this before. You know, we've talked about this in 279, and I know y'all talked about this in other classes other than COMD classes, okay? Because these are some very classical learned behavioral situations. On Monday, we are going to be virtual again. We're going to do virtual on Monday. Then group B is going to be in class on Wednesday, and group A is going to be in class on Friday. Okay, any questions? How's the pseudo? Y'all gonna get that uploaded today, right? That's due today. Everybody's doing all right with your pseudo stuttering project? Anybody want to tell us about their experience? Well, I tell you what, we'll talk about that on Monday. We'll include that on Monday. Okay? All right, I will see y'all later. Y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.